It was the morning after Christmas. Along the southern coasts of Asia, the 26th of December 2004 began quietly. In beachside villages, resorts, and fishing towns, the sun rose just as it always had. The sky was clear. The air was still. The only sounds were those of waves reaching the shore and the early movement of daily life. Hotel staff preparing breakfast, children running barefoot along the sand, and fishermen uncoiling their nets for a routine trip to sea. Across Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and India, families were beginning their day. In Aceh, the northern tip of Sumatra, women swept courtyards with palm brooms while pots of water boiled slowly indoors. Men gathered at markets, motorcycles passed through narrow alleys, and children prepared to return to school after the holiday. There were no warnings in the air, no signs that would suggest what was building deep beneath the sea, hundreds of kilometers offshore. In the beach towns of southern Thailand, places like Khao Lak and Phuket, international tourists were finishing their breakfast buffets. Some were planning boat trips. Others were reading novels in the shade, their feet dug lightly into the sand. It was the height of the tourist season. Families from Sweden, Germany, Australia, and the UK had booked their holidays months in advance. Many had arrived on Christmas Eve. The atmosphere was relaxed. Children built sandcastles. Parents reclined under umbrellas. Hotel balconies looked out over an ocean that barely moved. In Sri Lanka, the trains were running. The morning service from Colombo to Gal carried more passengers than usual. Families traveling home after Christmas Mass, young people heading to the beach, vendors balancing baskets of fruit and tea as they walked between carriages. The sea shimmered to the west of the track. It was calm, pale, and distant. On the southeastern coast of India, in the state of Tamil Nadu, the fishing villages along Nagapattinam were already busy. The sea was central to life there, not as scenery but as survival. Most of the men had already gone out on their boats. Women waited with baskets and knives, ready to clean and sort the morning catch. The shore was dotted with children playing between moored canoes and wooden carts. It was a Sunday, but no different from any other. Church services were beginning. Fires were lit for mid-morning cooking. And far below the surface of the Indian Ocean, where the Indo-Australian tectonic plate presses under the Eurasian plate, a shift was beginning. There was no sound, no rupture above the water, but deep under the seabed, a fault line that had held its tension for centuries suddenly gave way. At 7:58 local time, a section of the Earth's crust, more than 1,200 kilometers long, snapped upward. The sea above it was pushed with it. In less than 10 minutes, an enormous volume of water had been displaced. The energy released by the movement was equivalent to several thousand atomic bombs. A wall of water began to travel outward in all directions. The surface of the ocean seemed undisturbed to the eye. The wave was not yet visible, but underneath, momentum had already been set into motion. The earthquake registered as magnitude 9.1 on the Richter scale. It was one of the strongest ever recorded. Within minutes, seismologists in distant countries registered the event. Instruments at monitoring centers in the Pacific and in Tokyo confirmed the quake's size. But the Indian Ocean did not have a tsunami warning system. No automated alerts were sent to coastal towns. There were no sirens, no broadcasts, no evacuation plans. On the beaches of Thailand, guests noticed a subtle change in the sea. In some places, the water began to draw back from the shore, slowly at first, then more dramatically. Coral that had never been exposed was suddenly visible. Fish flapped in the sand. Children walked further out, laughing and pointing. Tourists took photographs of the strange low tide. In Aceh, there was no warning at all. The wave was already approaching. It moved fast, hundreds of kilometers per hour, but gave no indication of its power until the final moments. There was no towering wall of water visible from a distance. Instead, in many places, it arrived like a rising current. Quiet, massive, and inescapable. But none of that had happened yet. At 8 a.m., the world still held its shape. Fishermen tugged nets toward the shore. A woman rinsed clothes by a stream that fed into the sea. A child stood on a veranda holding a cup of tea. Tourists set their towels on lounge chairs and adjusted their sunglasses. And on the open ocean, traveling faster than the eye could detect, a series of waves was already underway. Not waves shaped by wind or tide, but waves built by the movement of the Earth itself, carrying with them the beginning of an event that would touch 14 countries, take over 230,000 lives, and leave behind a coastline transformed by silence, loss, and water that would not return to where it came from. In the minutes after the earthquake struck off the coast of Sumatra, there was no immediate alarm. In Banda Aceh, the provincial capital of Indonesia's Aceh region, some people felt the shaking. Ceiling fans swayed. Glasses rattled on kitchen shelves. A few residents stepped outside, unsure whether what they had felt had been real or imagined. It had lasted only a moment, long enough to notice, not long enough to fear. In many areas farther inland, the shaking was barely felt at all. Even along the coast, the tremor passed without urgency. In buildings that had been made to sway gently during earthquakes, nothing cracked. Some guests in hotels slept through it entirely. There were no sirens. No indication that what had just occurred beneath the seabed had been catastrophic. People returned to their meals. Children went back to their games. Along the beaches of southern Thailand, the stillness continued. At resorts in Khao Lak, staff refilled coffee pots and greeted guests at breakfast. Children played in the pools. A few travelers returned from morning walks. Everything appeared ordinary. The tide was low, slightly lower than usual, but not alarmingly so. A handful of people noticed the retreat of the sea. They took pictures. Some followed it out, walking past the normal shoreline to explore what was usually hidden: seashells, rocks, coral exposed by the retreating water. In Phuket, tourists relaxed under umbrellas. The air was warm, and the waves had grown strangely quiet. A few people noticed the ocean behaving differently, the way it had drawn back, almost as if it had paused. But there was no panic. There was nothing loud or obvious to suggest what was happening just offshore. In the Indian state of Tamil Nadu, most coastal families remained unaware that an earthquake had occurred at all. Morning routines continued. On the beach in Nagapattinam, children chased each other near fishing boats while women prepared breakfast. There were no visible signs of threat. Radio stations played film music. Churches and temples held their usual services. And out at sea, fishermen worked as they did every morning, unaware of what was moving beneath them. At the same time, in Colombo, Sri Lanka, the daily train service known as the Queen of the Sea made its way south along the coast. It was a slow, familiar route. The carriages were crowded with people returning from Christmas holidays. Some sat by the windows, watching the ocean pass by just meters from the track. The train moved steadily, without interruption. The sea remained calm. From inside the train, there was no sign of what was coming. In Banda Aceh, closer to the epicenter, a few people had begun to notice the tide drawing back further than it ever had before. Boats tilted on dry sand. Puddles of seawater shimmered where the shoreline had once been. Some residents paused to look, confused. Others took the opportunity to collect fish stranded on the exposed seabed. No one knew what it meant. There was no institutional memory of tsunamis here. No early warning system. No training in evacuation. The ocean looked strange, but it didn't look violent. It was only the animals that moved first. In some places, dogs broke from their leashes and ran inland. Birds flew toward the forest. Elephants in southern Thailand reportedly began moving away from the coast. But to the people on the ground, these movements seemed coincidental if they were noticed at all. Minutes passed. The waves traveled quickly, as fast as the speed of a commercial jet. But in the open ocean, their height was barely noticeable. Only as the water approached land where the sea floor rose did the wave begin to rise in form. It wasn't a single wave, not like the images often seen in fiction. It was a series, a surge, sometimes 3 or 4, sometimes more, each one carrying enormous force. In some areas, the wave would arrive within 15 minutes of the earthquake. In others, it would take over 2 hours. But in each case, it would arrive without warning. There were no official alerts. No loudspeakers. No sirens in local languages. Even in cities with television and radio coverage, no broadcasts were made. The systems simply didn't exist, and so people stayed where they were, close to the sea. In Sri Lanka, families gathered along the beach to enjoy the clear day. Vendors sold snacks. Parents carried small children. Tourists watched fishermen pull in their nets. Some of them, too, noticed the water pulling back from the shore, exposing long stretches of wet sand. In many cases, people took it as a curiosity, something interesting, a moment to take photographs. A group of tourists waded out to see stranded fish. A boy held up a starfish for a picture. It was now less than 5 minutes before the first wave would reach land in Banda Aceh. In a residential neighborhood near the coast, a man stepped outside his home to investigate the strange absence of sea noise. He noticed something he had never seen before. The line of the horizon looked different. It had changed shape, thickened somehow. It took him a few seconds to understand that it was moving. In a coastal mosque, the final lines of morning prayer were being recited. The room was quiet, cool, and full. Outside, someone began shouting, but few understood what the words meant. There were no instructions. No coordinated attempt to flee. Only confusion. On the beach, the sea had returned to its original line. It touched the edge of the sand once more. Then it kept going. In Banda Aceh, the water arrived without sound. There was no crashing wave from a distance. No moment where the sea rose like a wall and paused in the air. It moved inward with steady pressure, covering the beach, the sand, the street. People who had watched the water retreat were still standing in place when it came back. Some began to run, but not because they knew what it was, only because it moved too quickly to explain. By the time the first houses were flooded, there was already no clear escape. The wave pushed inland through narrow streets and alleys, lifting debris and pulling it with it. Wooden carts, plastic buckets, sandals, laundry. Everything moved with the water. A woman holding a baby was knocked down by the current in front of her home. She tried to stand, but the water reached above her chest within seconds. Furniture inside homes floated and struck walls. Concrete walls cracked. Doors buckled. Roofs gave way under the force. People ran toward mosques, hills, trees, anything that looked stronger than water. Some climbed to second floors. Others tried to hold on to anything they could. In neighborhoods with tightly packed homes, the water filled the spaces between buildings and surged upward. There was no time to collect belongings. No way to protect children. Entire families were separated within seconds. Streets disappeared. Electric poles fell. The first wave did not stop at the edge of town. It kept moving several kilometers inland. In the town of Mulabo, farther down the Sumatran coast, the wave struck just minutes later. Villagers had heard nothing. There was no shaking strong enough to cause alarm. The sea arrived looking like a fast tide, but the noise that followed, the sound of breaking wood, metal scraping concrete, and people shouting, erased any doubt. The force of the wave overturned fishing boats that had been dragged onto shore. It tore open shop fronts and swept away market stalls. In many cases, the wave carried people hundreds of meters before they could grab onto something solid. In Sri Lanka, the first wave reached the eastern coast near Batticaloa around 8:45 a.m. The sea receded dramatically beforehand, exposing hundreds of meters of seabed. Children ran out to collect fish. Adults watched, unsure of what they were seeing. Then the sea rose again, not in a single crash, but in a thick surge that did not stop. People screamed and ran inland. Some climbed trees. Others ran upstairs. But the water moved faster than most could run. It flooded homes, temples, schools. Concrete walls cracked and gave way. Streets filled with cars, motorcycles, people, and debris, all pushed together by the same directionless force. On the Colombo-Gal railway line, the Queen of the Sea train had just passed the town of Hikkaduwa when the first wave struck. Passengers saw the ocean approaching the tracks. Some thought it was rainwater. Others assumed the sea had surged unusually close. But as the water hit the train from the side, the carriages began to tilt. Windows shattered. Passengers clung to railings. Some jumped out. Others were trapped inside. The water quickly surrounded the train and lifted several of the cars off the track. It would later become one of the deadliest single incidents of the disaster. In Thailand, the wave came in a different form. In places like Khao Lak and Phi Phi Island, the sea retreated and left the beach looking strangely dry. Tourists walked far out to take photographs. Hotel staff paused in confusion. Some had seen the tide go out before, but never this far. Within minutes, the sea began returning. At first it looked like normal surf, then like a rushing tide, and then like a wall of white water that picked up speed. By 9:30 a.m., the first wave hit the beaches of southern Thailand. It washed over sunbeds and tables, over swimming pools and walkways. Glass windows shattered as the water surged into hotel lobbies. Guests on the ground floors had no time to run. Families on upper levels watched in shock as the beach they had walked on minutes earlier was swallowed. Vehicles in parking lots were pushed into walls. Boats were lifted onto rooftops. Trees bent and snapped. Those who had been on the beach had nowhere to go but up, or into the water. In the Indian coastal town of Vellankanni, Tamil Nadu, the beach was busy. It was a pilgrimage site, and Sunday services had drawn crowds. Fishermen noticed the sea drawing back just before 9 a.m. Some raised the alarm, but no one knew what the warning meant. When the wave arrived, it struck the shoreline with little resistance. Boats were crushed against concrete steps. Families along the waterfront had no time to react. Churches and homes were flooded. Survivors later recalled the sound of tin roofs being torn off and the sudden darkness that followed as the water pulled dirt and sand into the air. Everywhere the wave hit, the first few minutes followed a similar pattern: confusion, movement, and then a complete lack of visibility. The water was not clear. It was filled with pieces of buildings, furniture, vehicles, soil, and bodies. People who were submerged could not see. Many who tried to swim found themselves pulled by unfamiliar currents. Children were swept from parents. Parents were knocked unconscious. Those who survived often did so by clinging to trees, power lines, or upper floors. In some places, groups of people managed to pull others to safety. In others, no one was left standing. The first wave passed, but it did not leave. In many places, the water remained. The ground was covered in meters of debris. In some towns, the sea pulled back again, only to return minutes later with more force. And the people who had survived the first surge were left to face what would come next: a rising awareness that something terrible had happened, and no clear understanding of how much worse it would become. In the moments after the first wave passed, silence settled over the affected coastlines. It was not the silence of calm, but the absence of what had just been destroyed. Homes, voices, music, the sounds of life that had filled the air only minutes earlier. For those who had survived the initial surge, there was no immediate clarity. Most did not yet understand what had happened. Some believed it had been a freak wave, something violent but isolated. Others stood in shock, their bodies soaked, their clothes torn, looking out at water that had not fully receded. The destruction was immediate and overwhelming. Concrete buildings had cracked and collapsed. Vehicles were lodged in trees. Boats had been pushed through the walls of homes. Bodies lay where the water had left them. But for those who had climbed to rooftops, hills, or the upper floors of hotels, there was a moment, brief, uncertain, where it seemed like it might be over. In Banda Aceh, those who had made it to higher ground looked down at streets filled with wreckage. The water had pushed deep into the city, and in some places it had receded slightly, leaving mud, timber, and silence. Survivors began to climb down cautiously. Some searched for family. Others walked back into the ruins of their homes to find belongings or to look for signs of life. A few began to call out, looking for neighbors. They believed the worst had passed. But the ocean was not finished. Tsunamis often arrive not as a single wave, but in a series. The time between waves varies depending on geography and the nature of the underwater earthquake. In the Indian Ocean, after the first wave struck, the water pulled back again. In some places it happened quickly, in others more gradually. But the pattern repeated: retreat then return. For people who had just survived the first surge, the second came at the moment when they had just begun to move again. In Sri Lanka, along the southern coast, many survivors believed that the sea had returned to normal. They stepped back down from buildings to help others. Some went to search for missing relatives. In one village near Gal, a group of people began to carry the injured away from the shoreline, only to be struck by the second wave as they crossed an open road. It came from a slightly different direction and carried debris from the first wave, broken wood, glass, metal, turning the water into a force that destroyed everything in its path a second time. In Thailand, the second wave reached the resorts and beaches with more force than the first. Those who had begun helping the injured found themselves running again. Hotels that had lost their lower floors collapsed under new pressure. Emergency workers, guests, and local residents were trapped or swept inland. Some survivors described the second wave not just as stronger, but as deeper, reaching further into the land, flooding buildings that had remained dry the first time. In Khao Lak, where many resorts sat directly at sea level, the second wave caused structural collapse. Upper floors gave way. Stairwells filled with water. Those who had survived by climbing onto trees or rooftops now had to hold on again, this time with less strength and more fear. Communication systems failed. Mobile networks were overwhelmed or destroyed. Roads became impassable. In India, the second wave reached Tamil Nadu at a time when people were still gathering near the waterline. In Nagapattinam, fishermen who had rushed back to secure boats were caught in the second surge. The streets nearest the shore flooded again. Temples that had remained open during the first wave were damaged. Relief efforts, barely underway, were interrupted. In some communities, volunteers had begun organizing the injured in open areas. The second wave scattered them. Each location experienced the sequence differently, but the pattern was constant. The illusion of calm, then renewed chaos. The second wave brought with it more destruction, not only because of its height and speed, but because it caught people already weakened, exposed, and out in the open. The water stayed longer after the second wave. In low-lying areas, it filled the landscape. The line between sea and land disappeared. Electricity had gone out in most places. Communications were down. Helicopters had not yet arrived. Rescue teams had not yet mobilized. Most people were on their own. And then, in many places, the sea pulled back again. Those who had survived two waves began looking toward the ocean with a kind of exhaustion. They were wet, bleeding, covered in mud. Some had lost their shoes, their families, their homes. But they were still alive. They tried to make sense of what had happened. There was still no official word, no confirmation that this was a tsunami. The term itself was unfamiliar in many of the languages spoken in the affected regions. There was no memory of this happening before, no concept of what to expect next. In some towns, groups of survivors began walking inland. In others, they waited for help, unsure of where to go. Makeshift shelters were set up in school buildings, mosques, temples, and government offices. In tourist areas, hotel staff tried to organize headcounts. Foreign nationals gathered in lobbies or on higher ground, unsure how to contact embassies. Medical supplies were limited. People used clothing to stop bleeding, leaves to bind wounds, and sea water to rinse injuries. Then, in several locations, including Banda Aceh, coastal Thailand, and parts of Sri Lanka, a third wave came. It did not reach everywhere with the same strength, but where it hit, it carried more debris and reached even further inland. By now, the survivors were too tired to run. Some had already retreated as far inland as possible. Others were still searching for loved ones. The third wave added to the destruction, collapsing the few remaining structures, washing away survivors who had been sheltering in open areas, and closing roads that had just begun to be cleared. Only then, slowly, did the sea begin to settle. Not return to normal, not restore what had been lost, but stop rising. The water spread across the landscape like an inland lake, silent, heavy, and filled with the remains of buildings, vehicles, and lives. It carried no warning. It left no clear explanation. For many, the danger had ended, but the silence that followed carried a different kind of weight. The sound of waves had returned, but the people had not. And in 14 countries, from Indonesia to Kenya, from Sri Lanka to Somalia, the shape of the coastline and of the lives along it had changed forever. Not by fire, not by war, but by the movement of the sea and the absence of anything that could have warned them in time. When the water finally stopped moving, what remained was not stillness. It was confusion, fatigue, and a silence that felt unnatural. There were no sirens, no helicopters overhead, no announcements on loudspeakers. In the hardest hit places, there were no working phones, no electricity, and no roads left to drive. Survivors emerged slowly from broken buildings, from trees, from rooftops, from wherever they had managed to hold on, stepping into a landscape that no longer resembled the one they had known. In Banda Aceh, entire neighborhoods had vanished. Wooden homes had splintered completely. Cement structures had collapsed inward. The streets were filled with mud, timber, wires, metal, and bodies, many of them not visible at first, but buried under piles of debris. In some areas, water still reached halfway up the buildings. People walked through it carefully, looking for family members, carrying the injured on wooden doors and bed sheets. Some called out names. Others didn't speak at all. They moved with the kind of quiet that follows impact, not from understanding, but from shock. There were no emergency crews on the ground, no police, no fire services. The hospitals that were still standing had filled within the first hour, staffed by doctors and nurses who had also lost their homes, and in many cases, their families. Medical supplies were limited to what could be salvaged. In makeshift treatment spaces, children sat wrapped in wet blankets, eyes red from seawater, limbs bruised from debris. Some had broken bones. Others could not speak. The air was filled with the smell of salt water, fuel, and broken wood. In places where sewers had ruptured, the odor became more severe. There were insects already gathering in warm, stagnant water. Many people still wore the same clothes they had been wearing when the wave hit, torn, soaked, and streaked with mud. Shoes were rare. Most had been lost. In Thailand, hotel staff began organizing the injured where they could. Under trees, in surviving lobbies, near swimming pools that had not been emptied by the surge. Tourists searched for missing relatives, often barefoot and still in bathing suits. Some walked back toward the shore, despite warnings from local workers, hoping to find personal belongings, passports, or simply a place to sit and think. A few took photographs not to document but to process what had happened, to try and make it real. In Sri Lanka, the train near Paralia was no longer visible as a train. The carriages had been overturned and bent around one another. The tracks had been torn from the ground. Local villagers, many of whom had also lost their homes, tried to reach survivors inside the wreckage. They used axes and rocks to break open doors. Some climbed on top and pulled people through windows. Others stood beside the wreck, silent, unsure how to help. There was no coordinated effort yet. News had not spread. Each area believed it was the only one affected. Most assumed a single event had occurred, a wave, a storm, perhaps an unusual tide. Few realized it had been an earthquake, or that the devastation reached across multiple countries. People waited for news, but no radios were working. Electricity was out. Mobile phone towers were down or jammed. The only information came from what people could see with their own eyes. In India's Tamil Nadu state, villagers wandered the edges of their towns, unsure where the sea ended and the land began. Churches were filled with people who had fled from the shoreline. In some towns, priests and community leaders began organizing headcounts, collecting names, trying to reunite children with parents. Bodies were carried on makeshift stretchers, wooden doors, bamboo mats, anything that could hold weight. Many were covered in towels or cloth, not because of ritual, but because it felt wrong to leave them exposed. Throughout the region, people searched for clean water. Many wells had been contaminated with seawater. Bottled water was scarce. In some areas, survivors drank from broken pipes or collected rainwater in buckets and plastic bowls. Food was also limited. Most kitchens had been destroyed. Market stalls had been washed away. What little food remained was either soaked or spoiled. There were small moments of help. A neighbor carried a stranger's child. A fisherman gave his shirt to someone shivering. A woman offered her only dry blanket to someone older. In one town, a boy helped guide tourists to higher ground. In another, a man gave first aid using bandages from his own home. These were not organized rescue efforts. They were acts of necessity, made without planning or instruction. In the hills above the coastlines, people watched from a distance. Some had run inland when the first wave came. Others had been there all along. Now they stood looking down at flooded towns, unable to reach them. Footpaths had washed out. Bridges were gone. The air was heavy with heat, silence, and a growing awareness that something massive had happened. Something too large to understand fully in a single day. Some survivors tried to leave immediately, walking inland in search of help. Others stayed, either because they were waiting for family or because they didn't know which way to go. In every affected region, the first day ended without clarity. There were no reliable numbers, no confirmed death toll, no names read out, only questions. Who had survived? Who had not? Where the next wave might come from, and what this meant. The tsunami had passed, but the disaster had only just begun. On the morning of December 26th, while the sea moved inward across the coasts of the Indian Ocean, the rest of the world was largely unaware. It was still early in Europe. In the United States, it was the middle of the night. Newsrooms were operating with reduced staff because of the holidays. Most people were still asleep or just beginning to return from Christmas visits. The magnitude of what had occurred was not yet visible from outside the region. The first international awareness of the earthquake came not from eyewitnesses or journalists, but from instruments. Seismographs in Alaska, Japan, and Hawaii recorded the 9.1 magnitude earthquake within minutes. At tsunami monitoring centers in the Pacific, staff reviewed the data and recognized the potential for a large ocean displacement. But the Indian Ocean did not have a formal tsunami warning system. There were no prearranged communication lines with governments in the region. There was no process for issuing evacuation orders or real-time alerts. And even if there had been, it was already too late. By the time the data was confirmed and analysts began alerting contacts, the waves had already reached several coastlines. In Banda Aceh, the water had receded. In Sri Lanka, towns had been flattened. In southern Thailand, entire beachfront resorts were underwater. But the information had not yet reached the public, and in many countries, government officials still did not know what was happening in their own coastal towns. The first images to appear on international television were grainy. A single video clip showed brown water sweeping through a resort in Phuket. Another showed people running across a flooded road in India. The footage was filmed by tourists and hotel staff, uploaded slowly over unstable connections, then broadcast by regional news outlets. There was no context, no confirmed numbers, just fragments of panic, water, and confusion. It was only hours later that full reports began to emerge. Embassies started receiving calls from citizens abroad. Travelers who had survived began sending emails or messages through hotel phones. International aid organizations began calling their field staff. Journalists on vacation became reporters. Satellite imagery showed changes to the coastline. Slowly, the scale became clearer. In Sri Lanka, local media began broadcasting reports of flooded villages. The government declared a national emergency. In Thailand, emergency crews began arriving in beach towns, reporting entire stretches of coast with no remaining structures. In India, hospitals filled with the injured. The Tamil Nadu state government began organizing body recovery, though many areas remained inaccessible. Indonesia was slow to respond, not due to unwillingness, but because of the scale of destruction. Banda Aceh, the region closest to the earthquake's epicenter, was almost completely cut off. Many roads had disappeared. Bridges had collapsed. Local governments had lost both buildings and personnel. Survivors had no electricity, no mobile signal, and no way to inform authorities of what had happened. Entire communities remained silent, not because they had not suffered, but because they had no voice that could reach beyond their borders. By the afternoon of December 26th, aid organizations like the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontieres, and the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs began releasing early statements. These statements were cautious. At the time, they estimated hundreds feared dead. That number would grow with each passing hour. The first flights of aid were organized before midnight. Reconnaissance teams, small groups of medical workers, and supply drops. But logistics were difficult. Airports in the worst-hit areas were damaged or operating beyond capacity. Runways were flooded. Fuel was scarce. There was no coordination yet between international and local efforts. Each country faced the disaster separately. There was no central authority guiding the response. In many coastal villages, this meant that survivors spent the first 24 hours entirely on their own. They treated injuries with what they had. They buried the dead in mass graves, sometimes without identification. Food was shared communally when it could be found. In Sri Lanka and Indonesia, survivors tied cloths to trees or rooftops to signal for help. In India, villagers walked for hours to reach police stations or municipal offices, only to find that no one there had heard what happened. Many towns could not be reached at all. Communication between countries was slow. Indonesia did not yet know the death toll in Thailand. Sri Lanka did not know that entire islands in the Andaman chain had gone silent. Foreign governments, trying to locate their citizens abroad, began contacting hotels and consulates. Passenger lists were requested. Tour operators were told to report missing people. But even that process was inconsistent. In Europe, news coverage slowly took over the holiday programming. As evening fell, the first live broadcasts appeared. Reporters stood in front of rubble. Images of debris-filled streets, overturned fishing boats, and collapsed houses were shown without commentary. The numbers changed constantly, first hundreds, then thousands. By midnight, some agencies were estimating that tens of thousands may have died. But no one knew for sure. The first confirmed large-scale fatalities were in Sri Lanka and India. Reports from Indonesia remained minimal. Banda Aceh was nearly unreachable. Helicopters could not land. Roads were gone. For many, this silence was the first sign that the situation there might be worse than anyone had imagined. And yet, despite growing awareness, the response was slow. Not out of indifference, but because the systems that should have coordinated emergency action had never been built. The Indian Ocean had never experienced a tsunami of this magnitude in modern recorded history. Most countries did not have evacuation plans for tsunamis. Most coastal towns had no sirens, no community drills, and no historical memory of such an event. By the end of the first day, aid had begun moving, but not quickly. Most survivors still had no water, no food, and no contact with the outside world. They slept on rooftops, inside cars, in the remains of buildings. The sea had withdrawn, but left behind more than wreckage. It had created silence, uncertainty, and an overwhelming question shared by millions across 14 countries. Where was help? And when would it arrive? In the days following the tsunami, the world began to understand the size of the disaster, not through a single announcement, but through a steady stream of numbers, reports, and images. There was no moment when the full scale was known. It arrived piece by piece, each detail worse than the last. The confirmed death toll passed 10,000 within 24 hours, then 20,000, then 40,000. By the end of the third day, it was clear that the number would not stop rising for some time. In Banda Aceh, the silence finally broke when helicopters from the Indonesian military and international aid organizations reached the outskirts of the city. From the air, what they saw could not be described as damage. It was absence. The coastline had changed. Entire blocks were gone. Landmarks were missing. The waves had flattened the city for kilometers inland. Roads had disappeared. Villages marked on maps no longer existed. The crews on board had prepared for destruction. What they found was a place where even the outlines of buildings had been removed. Landing was difficult. There were few stable surfaces. In some areas, helicopters dropped supplies directly to survivors in schoolyards and open fields. Others returned to base without landing at all. Relief workers carried cameras. Their first images of flooded towns, mass graves, survivors holding signs made from torn cloth became the visual language of the disaster. Within hours, they were broadcast worldwide. In Sri Lanka, the government reported that entire coastal communities had been wiped out. Medical teams worked in shifts, often in makeshift clinics without electricity. Survivors were treated for injuries, infections, dehydration, and shock. Thousands of people had lost their homes. Aid began arriving from abroad, but it was slowed by damaged infrastructure. Trucks carrying food and medicine were delayed by roads blocked with debris. In some regions, survivors had to walk for hours to reach distribution points. Thailand began to organize its emergency response. Search and rescue operations expanded across the southern provinces. Divers were sent to locate missing persons in sunken buildings and boats. Temporary morgues were set up in temples, sports halls, and government buildings. The government began the long process of identifying the dead, not just locals, but thousands of foreign tourists. Some were identified through passports found in the rubble, others through dental records, DNA samples, or personal belongings. In the early days, volunteers worked alongside local officials. Villagers helped carry bodies, stack supplies, and bury the dead. The smell of decomposition grew stronger each day. Health officials worried about disease. Mass graves became necessary, not out of disregard, but out of urgency. In many places, religious leaders blessed the ground quickly before burial. Families were asked to identify loved ones from photographs or descriptions, sometimes in groups of hundreds. In India, coastal Tamil Nadu was mourning in silence. Some fishing villages lost more than half their population. Women sat in rows, many unable to speak. Children wandered alone in camps, having been found by rescue workers with no information about their parents. The government set up temporary shelters. Aid began arriving from other Indian states. Volunteers cooked meals in large pots under tents. Supplies were shared by hand, rationed without formality. Everywhere, the effort was not just about rescue, but also registration. Authorities tried to keep records: who had survived, who was missing, who had died. But the system struggled under the weight. Entire families had disappeared. Some communities had no representatives left to speak for them. In other places, lists were written by hand and nailed to trees or pinned to notice boards. Bulletin walls filled with photographs of the missing. Some included names. Others simply read, "Seen near temple, age 7, no shoes." Satellite imagery helped confirm what was already feared. The destruction was continent-wide. In Myanmar, Bangladesh, the Maldives, and parts of the eastern coast of Africa, damage had also occurred. Smaller in scale, but still deadly. In Somalia, over 200 people died when the waves crossed the Indian Ocean. In the Seychelles and Kenya, coastal villages were flooded. Boats were destroyed, livelihoods lost. The wave had traveled more than 5,000 kilometers from its source. No country in its path was untouched. International response accelerated. Dozens of countries pledged aid. Military planes from the United States, Australia, Germany, and Japan began delivering supplies. Naval ships arrived off the coasts of Indonesia and Sri Lanka, carrying helicopters, medicine, and emergency shelters. Relief agencies began coordinating large-scale operations, dividing responsibilities by region. Camps were built. Water purification units were installed. Mass kitchens were established to feed displaced families. Still, the need grew faster than the response. In Aceh, people stood for hours in the heat waiting for food. In Sri Lanka, mothers searched through rows of bodies, looking for a child's face. In Thailand, families left flowers at the sites of collapsed buildings. The sea had receded, but its damage reached into every part of daily life, not just physically, but emotionally. Grief hung in the air, heavy and collective. The numbers changed every hour. Governments updated death tolls, often by the tens of thousands. Aid agencies revised estimates. Health officials issued warnings about waterborne disease. And journalists, trying to cover each affected country, struggled to keep up. Each location had its own story, its own suffering. And beneath every statistic was a person, a life that had ended not because of war or politics or violence, but because the sea had moved in a way no one expected, and no one was prepared to stop. In the aftermath of the tsunami, after the waves had receded and the dead had been counted in the thousands, the disaster entered a slower, quieter phase. One defined not by urgency, but by searching. not for supplies and not only for the injured, but for people who had simply disappeared. In many places, the rescue phase had ended within 48 hours. What came next was harder to define. There were no longer cries beneath the rubble, but there were questions. Thousands of them. Across Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and India, missing person boards began to appear in shelters, outside hospitals, near refugee camps, and on the walls of public buildings. Handwritten notes were pinned to doors and taped to trees. Some were carefully written with full names, physical descriptions, and last known locations. Others were desperate and vague, first names only, no photograph, just the sentence, "If you see her, please bring her here." The paper sagged in the humidity. Ink ran from the rain. Still, people kept looking. In Banda Aceh, survivors walked for hours between shelters, asking for anyone who had seen their mother, their daughter, their husband. Many had no photograph. They spoke with strangers, showed clothing, held out small items, a bracelet, a shoe, hoping someone might recognize them. Children too young to speak sat alone in schoolyards and church basements, waiting for someone who might never return. The effort to identify the dead became one of the largest forensic tasks in recent history. In Thailand, where thousands of foreign tourists had been killed, authorities established temporary morgues in temples and sports halls. Victims were photographed, tagged, and placed in refrigerated containers. Specialists from dozens of countries arrived to assist. They used dental records, fingerprints, and DNA samples. Personal belongings, rings, watches, tattoos were logged carefully. It was slow work. Some families received confirmation within days. Others waited months. For every body recovered, there were many more that remained missing. The sea had carried people far from where they had last been seen. In some cases, entire families had been swept away, leaving no one to report them. In others, the damage was too severe for identification. Many were buried in mass graves, marked only by date and location. Religious leaders did what they could. Prayers were read quickly. Names were written on lists. But in the end, many of the dead were never named again. In Sri Lanka, families searched hospitals along the southern coast. Some walked barefoot for days, carrying food wrapped in cloth, hoping to find a child or parent alive in one of the overcrowded wards. Aid workers tried to keep records, but the scale was too large. Displaced people moved from one shelter to another. Language differences made registration harder. In some places, the same missing person was reported to 5 or 6 different agencies. In India, photographs of the dead were posted outside municipal offices. Families came each day to look. In Nagapattinam, one father visited every morning and stared silently at the wall of images, his hands behind his back. He never spoke. He never asked for help. He just stood and looked row by row. Children separated from their parents became a special priority. Governments and NGOs established systems to track and reunite unaccompanied minors. Some had been found crying in trees, others sitting alone on rooftops, too young to explain where they had come from. Staff and volunteers cared for them gently, carefully, but the numbers were overwhelming. In many cases, it was unclear whether the parents were dead, alive, or simply somewhere else, searching too. As the search continued, the emotional toll deepened. In the first days, adrenaline had carried many survivors forward. The instinct to move, to help, to act had provided purpose. But now, in the weeks that followed, people sat for long periods without speaking. Survivors in shelters stared at the floor. Meals were eaten quietly. Sleep came irregularly, interrupted by nightmares or the sound of wind mistaken for waves. There were still signs of life. In a shelter in Phuket, a woman found her cousin unexpectedly, days after believing her entire family was gone. In Sri Lanka, a mother reunited with her son after recognizing a scratch on his forehead in a news broadcast. In Aceh, 2 sisters were matched by a relief worker who had remembered their last names. These moments were rare, but they spread quickly. In places full of loss, even one reunion gave people reason to keep searching. International organizations began to build databases. Names were logged and cross-checked. Photos were uploaded. Lists were printed and shared between camps. Embassies issued updates. Volunteers helped translate. Still, the numbers grew. Tens of thousands remained missing weeks after the tsunami. Many would never be confirmed. In the absence of answers, people created their own forms of closure. Some held small ceremonies on beaches. Others placed flowers at the edge of the water where their homes had once stood. In Thailand, tourists returned to ruined hotels to leave candles and notes. In India, villagers lit lamps along the shoreline. And in Banda Aceh, a man sat in the ruins of a mosque each day, reciting the names of his wife and children aloud, not because anyone asked him to, but because he didn't want their names to disappear. The grief was not loud. It settled slowly into the routines of displacement. It lived in the way people looked out to sea without speaking, or the way they paused at names they no longer expected to see written down. It filled the gaps in conversation. It shaped the silence. The search continued, not because people expected success, but because stopping felt impossible. For many, not finding someone meant holding on to the only thing left, the possibility that they were still alive. And in the weeks that followed, that possibility, however faint, was the only thing that gave some people the strength to wake up and begin again. In the weeks following the tsunami, once the immediate danger had passed and the bodies had been buried, attention shifted toward what would come next. It was not a single moment of rebuilding, and not a plan that began at once. It started slowly, often without direction, as individuals and families began returning to the ruins of what had once been their homes. Not because they were ready, but because they had nowhere else to go. In Indonesia, the devastation in Aceh province had erased entire towns. What remained was a landscape of scattered debris, broken roads, and foundations without walls. Families returned not to rebuild, but to look. They walked through the places where their homes had been, trying to find anything that could be recovered. A cooking pot, a child's shirt, a photograph not yet destroyed by water. In many areas, they pitched tents made from tarps and salvaged wood, just meters from where they had lost family. There was no formal housing. The government had not yet announced a plan. But people could not wait. In Sri Lanka, the government began to speak about a buffer zone, a designated area along the coast where rebuilding would not be allowed. Officials explained that it was a safety measure intended to prevent future loss of life. But for those who had lived their entire lives within sight of the water, it felt like exile. Fishermen argued that they could not work if they were moved inland. Families protested that they had nothing else. Still, in some places, the rule was enforced. In others, people returned anyway, unwilling to leave what little they had left. In southern India, many villages began reconstruction on their own. With aid slow to arrive, local residents used traditional methods to repair homes: bamboo, thatch, clay. International NGOs eventually arrived, offering prefabricated shelters and cash assistance. But early on, people relied mostly on one another. Women cooked communally for displaced families. Men cleared debris from wells and roads. School teachers reopened classrooms in temporary tents. The pace was slow. The work was difficult. But life had to move forward, even when the past remained just beyond the shoreline. Thailand faced a different challenge. Along the Andaman coast, much of the affected area had been built for tourism. Resorts, restaurants, dive shops, and beachfront hotels had been destroyed. Many of the people who lived and worked there were migrants or contract workers with no legal claim to the land. When aid arrived, it focused first on registered citizens, leaving others, including stateless families, without support. In some communities, rebuilding came quickly. Foreign investors returned. Hotels were repaired. New buildings were raised. But in others, especially small fishing villages, progress was slower. The land was scarred, and so were the people. The international aid response grew rapidly. Billions of dollars were pledged by governments, NGOs, and private donors. The speed and size of the response were unprecedented. But coordination was difficult. Some villages received food, but no tents. Others received tents, but no water. Materials were delivered to the wrong ports. Language barriers delayed planning. Local governments struggled to manage the flow. Agencies overlapped. In some places, politics interfered. Promises were made but not kept. Still, over time, systems began to form. Relief camps became temporary housing. Temporary housing became permanent. Schools reopened. Clinics began treating long-term injuries. And slowly, the question of what came next shifted from rescue to recovery, and from recovery to memory. But rebuilding was not just about buildings. It was about choices. In Banda Aceh, some families chose not to return to their original homes, even when allowed. The land felt changed. The sea no longer felt like a neighbor. Others returned but rebuilt further inland. Some carried with them tokens, a rusted key, a saved photograph, as if to anchor what had been lost in what was being rebuilt. Psychological support was limited in many areas. Trauma remained mostly untreated. Survivors described sleepless nights, recurring dreams, fear of water, fear of sudden noises. Children cried during storms. Some refused to go near the sea again. Counseling services, when they arrived, were overwhelmed. Many people kept their grief silent, carrying it inside their daily routines. In the way they moved, the way they paused before walking close to the shore, the way they counted the missing even after the lists had stopped growing. Religious and cultural responses to the disaster shaped recovery in different ways. In Buddhist communities in Thailand and Sri Lanka, temples became centers for remembrance. Monks led rituals for the dead, often with hundreds gathered to listen. In Muslim communities in Aceh, prayers were held daily in damaged mosques, the floor still covered in dust. In India, Christian, Hindu, and Muslim leaders organized joint ceremonies along the coast, reading names and pouring water back into the sea. No one tried to replace what was gone. They simply acknowledged it. By the end of the second month, some of the worst-hit areas were still without electricity or permanent shelter. Aid agencies began to shift their focus from immediate survival to livelihood support. Fishing boats were rebuilt. Tools were replaced. Small grants were offered to restart shops. But many survivors no longer had the energy or the confidence to begin again. Too much had changed. The physical cleanup took time. Roads had to be cleared. Bodies still surfaced in remote places. In Banda Aceh, a ship had been carried 3 kilometers inland and now sat embedded in a neighborhood. No one knew how to remove it. Eventually, it was left where it landed. In time, it became a memorial. There were also tensions about aid distribution, about land rights, about which communities were receiving more support than others. In some places, survivors protested. In others, they gave up trying to ask. Not everyone who suffered received the same help. Not everyone who received help could use it. Rebuilding was uneven. Some towns rose quickly from the rubble. Others remained half-finished, half-abandoned years later. But everywhere, people kept going. Not because they were ready, not because they were whole, but because there was no alternative. Homes were rebuilt not out of optimism, but out of necessity. And under every roof that returned, there was a room that felt quieter than before. As the waters receded and the world watched the destruction unfold across 14 countries, governments were forced to respond not only to the humanitarian crisis, but also to the deeper questions the disaster had raised. The Indian Ocean tsunami had revealed how vulnerable entire regions were to a force that most had never prepared for. It had also shown how uneven the protection had been. Some areas had early warnings, others had none. Some communities were rebuilt, others left behind. In the months that followed, international focus shifted from emergency aid to long-term recovery and prevention. Governments pledged new investments in disaster preparedness. The United Nations and regional bodies began organizing efforts to install a tsunami early warning system across the Indian Ocean, something that had not existed on December 26th. Until then, most tsunami detection systems were concentrated in the Pacific, where countries like Japan and the United States had long experience with earthquake-related coastal threats. Now, new pressure brought change. By mid-2005, planning began for the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning and Mitigation System, led by UNESCO. It included seismic sensors, ocean buoys, coastal tide gauges, and new communication protocols between nations. Over the next 2 years, stations were built across the region. in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and beyond, linked by satellite to regional centers. In theory, future tsunamis could be detected early enough to send warnings. But implementation varied by country. Some invested heavily in training and drills. Others struggled with maintenance, funding, or political will. At the national level, each government responded differently. Indonesia, the country hardest hit, faced the most complex recovery. Aceh province had not only suffered massive physical destruction, but had also been the center of a long-running internal conflict. In the months following the tsunami, an unexpected peace agreement was signed between the Indonesian government and the Free Aceh movement. The disaster had forced both sides to reevaluate. Aid poured into the province, and reconstruction became both a humanitarian and political process. Still, thousands of survivors remained in transitional housing for years. Some communities were never fully rebuilt. Sri Lanka enacted its buffer zone policy, preventing rebuilding within 100 to 200 meters of the shoreline. The policy was met with criticism, especially by fishing communities who argued that their livelihoods required access to the sea. Enforcement was inconsistent. In tourist areas, hotels were quietly rebuilt close to the water. In poor neighborhoods, families were relocated further inland, often without infrastructure. The policy was eventually relaxed in some areas, but left lasting tension about whose rights were prioritized. India focused on rebuilding coastal villages and restoring livelihoods. Fishing boats were replaced. Compensation was issued, though not always evenly. Mental health services were limited. The disaster did prompt new investment in coastal monitoring and hazard mapping, but for many survivors, the government's role was most visible in the form of promised aid that didn't always arrive as expected. In wealthier areas, recovery was faster. In poorer fishing communities, many relied on NGOs for years. Thailand, whose tourist regions had been devastated, moved quickly to rebuild. Hotels and infrastructure were restored at remarkable speed. Tourism returned within a year, but many local workers, including Burmese migrants and low-income Thais, received less support. Identification of foreign victims took months, involving one of the largest forensic efforts in history. The Thai government introduced new protocols for emergency management, but in rural areas, disaster drills remained rare. Internationally, the tsunami had a powerful impact on how disasters were viewed. It was one of the first truly global humanitarian responses in the digital age. Donations came in from over 100 countries. Private citizens gave billions through websites, television fundraisers, and direct contributions to NGOs. Relief agencies faced logistical challenges, simply absorbing the scale of public support. Many organizations received more than they had ever handled before. The pressure to spend quickly and visibly led to tensions between effectiveness and visibility. Some countries established permanent memorials. In Sweden, where over 500 nationals died, the highest death toll outside Asia, the tsunami remains one of the country's deepest national tragedies. Monuments were built. Commemorative services are held each year. Survivors have published accounts, and families of the missing organized for years to improve emergency response abroad. In Germany, Finland, Japan, and the United Kingdom, similar efforts were made. Some focused on improving consular services in disasters. Others funded direct aid. In Australia, where over 26,000 citizens were in the region during the disaster, a national memorial was established in Canberra. Families lobbied for better coordination in future emergencies. But not all countries remembered in the same way. In some parts of the affected region, especially where poverty was highest, the tsunami became a memory carried mostly by individuals and families. Public memorials were built in places like Banda Aceh, where a large floating ship still sits where the wave left it, preserved as a physical reminder. But in many smaller towns and villages, the only signs are in the stories people tell. The date etched in the wall of a school, the mosque that was never rebuilt, the family that never returned. The scale of the event made remembrance difficult. With so many lives lost across such a wide area, there was no single narrative. Each country, each province, each town experienced the tsunami differently. Some focused on rebuilding quickly, looking forward. Others struggled to return to the sea at all. In certain areas, the trauma remained close to the surface. In others, it faded, not because it was less severe, but because silence became easier than reliving it. For governments, the tsunami left behind lessons in policy and response. But for survivors, the legacy was more personal. It was not just about preparedness or infrastructure. It was about absence. And in that absence, decisions had to be made about where to live, who to trust, and how to carry forward without forgetting the moment the sea rose and changed everything. Years after the waves had pulled back, the impact of the tsunami remained. Not always visibly, not always spoken aloud, but quietly woven into the lives of those who had survived it. For many, the disaster did not end with the rebuilding of homes or the reopening of schools. It lived in memory, in silence, in the rhythm of ordinary days where something had changed and never returned to what it once was. In coastal towns across Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and Thailand, people tried to return to routines. Children went back to school. Markets reopened. The smell of sea salt returned to the air, this time mixed with smoke from cooking fires, not disaster. But beneath the surface, the losses remained. Some families still carried photographs of the missing in plastic sleeves tucked inside wallets. Others stopped talking about the day altogether, not out of denial, but because there were no words left for what had been taken. Many of the children who had survived grew up with partial memories. Some had lost one or both parents. Some had been found alone and raised by extended family, neighbors, or foster homes. A few had never been reunited with anyone they knew. Their stories followed them into adulthood. Teachers described students who withdrew when the ocean was mentioned. Counselors, when available, noted signs of post-traumatic stress that surfaced in small, quiet ways. Reluctance to sleep alone, panic during storms, the need to check on siblings multiple times a night. In Banda Aceh, where entire neighborhoods had been wiped away, survivors spoke of the difficulty in placing grief. When an entire family was gone, there was no one left to share memories with. The weight of survival was something people rarely discussed directly. They worked, they prayed, they carried out family duties. But they also carried guilt for having been away that day, guilt for running while others stayed behind, guilt for rebuilding a life that others never had the chance to continue. Counseling services expanded slowly. In Thailand, programs were introduced to support survivors and bereaved families, but mental health remained stigmatized in many communities. People preferred to cope privately. In Sri Lanka, Buddhist monks spoke of impermanence and suffering as part of life. In India, families leaned on faith and ritual. In Indonesia, survivors attended group prayers and readings of the Quran. For many, religion became not only a comfort, but a structure for grief, a way to name the unanswerable without having to solve it. In fishing villages, some refused to return to the sea. Men who had once made their living from the water found work inland instead, in construction, in markets, in fields. Others went back, but only with hesitation. Boats were rebuilt, but trust in the sea was harder to repair. Even years later, the sound of a strong tide could bring unease. For children born after the disaster, the ocean was something they were warned about before they were allowed to play near it. Stories were told carefully, sometimes as caution, sometimes as explanation. Tourist areas recovered faster in appearance. Hotels were rebuilt. Beaches were cleaned. Visitors returned. But many of the local workers had lost family in the tsunami. They served drinks, made beds, led dive tours, all while carrying memories of the day when the sea had taken everything. Some chose not to speak about it. Others shared their stories with guests who asked, often in soft voices, during quiet moments in the afternoon when business slowed. For families who had lost children, the pain changed over time. It became less sharp, but never distant. Birthdays passed. School years came and went. Photographs remained on shelves, sometimes framed, sometimes hidden in drawers. In some cultures, shrines were kept in the home. In others, the names were spoken during prayers. A few families named newborns after those they had lost, not to replace them, but to keep something of them present. The trauma was not only emotional. Physical injuries lingered. Some survivors lived with long-term disabilities, amputations, nerve damage, chronic infections. In many countries, medical follow-up was limited. Aid workers had moved on. Clinics were understaffed. Survivors with serious injuries relied on neighbors and relatives. Some never returned to full employment. Others continued working despite pain, not out of strength, but out of need. There were also the quiet economic impacts. People who had lost documents during the flood had to start over, rebuilding ID records, land ownership papers, school certificates. In communities without formal systems, that process was slow or impossible. Some lost access to pensions or insurance. Others were unable to prove who they were. A few remarried without ever confirming that their first spouses had died, not out of disrespect, but out of reality. The bodies had never been found. Among young people who had survived as children, there was often a subtle distance from the sea. It showed up in drawings, in classroom stories, in the way they responded to sound. Teachers described a generation that had grown up with both the absence of many adults and the quiet caution of those who remained. These were not children raised in fear, but children raised in awareness. They knew what water could do. They had lived through a version of the world where everything could change in less than 5 minutes. For some, the experience of survival became a source of strength. They became teachers, nurses, aid workers. They told their stories in public schools. They helped others who had faced disaster. But they did not forget. And even when the world stopped watching, they remembered not just the water, but the days of silence that followed, the confusion, the mud, the sound of no help coming. There was no point at which the disaster was considered fully over. Time passed. Anniversaries came and went. Names were read aloud. Memorials were visited. But inside the homes that had been rebuilt, inside the daily routines of people who now walked different streets or worked different jobs, the memory of the tsunami did not sit in the past. It lived quietly alongside them, not always spoken, but never gone. Time has passed since the morning the ocean rose without warning. 2 decades have gone by. Children born after the tsunami have now grown into adults. Landscapes have changed. Hotels have reopened. New homes stand where old ones were swept away. Roads that were torn apart have been repaved. Trees that were uprooted have been replaced. But in many of the towns touched by the waves, what was lost has not been forgotten. In Banda Aceh, the fishing boats are back in the water. The streets are busy again. Markets are open. Life has resumed, not as it was, but in a different shape. Yet reminders of that day remain embedded in the city itself. The large ship that was carried several kilometers inland still stands in the middle of a residential neighborhood. It was never moved. Instead, it was left where the wave placed it, not because it could not be removed, but because it became something else. A sign, a warning, a memory. Nearby at the Tsunami Museum, visitors walk through dark corridors meant to recreate the sound and weight of water. Names are etched on walls. Voices whisper through speakers. But outside the museum, in the quiet parts of the city, many of the survivors no longer speak about the day directly. Some feel it is no longer necessary. Others feel it is too private. For many, the Real Museum is not a building, but memory. The faces they no longer see, the streets they no longer walk, the sea they no longer trust in quite the same way. In Sri Lanka, the damaged train tracks have been rebuilt. The Queen of the Sea runs again, but a monument stands near the spot where the train once came to rest underwater. Each year, survivors gather there to lay flowers and offer prayers. Some come in silence. Others speak of those they lost. A few simply stand and look out toward the sea. The waves roll in, just as they always have. But the coastline is marked now, not by visible scars, but by the knowledge of what once happened when everything changed in a matter of minutes. In Tamil Nadu, India, new seawalls line parts of the coast. Warning sirens have been installed in some fishing villages. Evacuation drills are held once a year. But many of the older residents do not need sirens to remember. They look at the sky differently now. They feel the earth differently. A change in the wind, a shift in the tide, an unusual silence, these are noticed. Not with panic, but with memory. It has become part of how they live. In Thailand, tourist towns have returned to normal on the surface. Travelers lie on beaches that were once filled with debris. Hotels stand tall again, but the workers who rebuilt them remember. Some were there. Some lost family. Some helped pull bodies from the water. Each year, small gatherings are held, not official ceremonies, but quiet moments among locals. Candles are lit. Names are shared. Not everyone comes. Not everyone speaks. But the act of remembering remains. Across the Indian Ocean region, memorials vary. Some are grand, built from stone and steel. Others are simple. A plaque near a tree, a photograph nailed to a doorframe, a line of text at the bottom of a prayer book. But the most enduring reminders are not the physical ones. They live in the habits people developed after the tsunami. The way a mother keeps her child within sight at the beach. The way a fisherman watches the tide before sleeping. The way a teacher lowers her voice when describing the power of the sea. The tsunami of 2004 was not the first disaster of its kind, and it will not be the last. But it was different in scale, in silence, in the way it crossed borders without warning. It did not ask who it struck. It did not stop for wealth or nationality or intention. It moved with force, and when it left the same thing everywhere: absence. For those who watched the wave come in, there was no forgetting. For those who lost family, the sea became something else, not just a place of life, but a place of separation. Some returned to it, others stayed away. Neither decision was easy, neither was wrong. In the years since, new generations have grown up with no direct memory of the disaster. They hear the stories, but they did not live them. Their connection comes through photographs, names on stones, and the occasional silence that settles over a room when the date comes around. They ask questions. Some are answered, some are not. The Indian Ocean tsunami did not just destroy homes. It changed time. It drew a line between before and after that still exists in the minds of millions. For those who survived, there is no single way to describe what was lost, because it was not only people or places or things. It was normalcy. It was certainty. It was the sense that the world would behave as expected. That certainty has not returned. But life continued anyway, slowly, unevenly, and without resolution. Not everything was rebuilt. Not everyone was found. And not every question was answered. But the memory of that morning, and the days that followed, remains. In the minds of those who lived through it. In the silence that still follows the sound of a strong wave. In the space between what was and what is now. And in the quiet presence of those who endured without being seen.